So today we're going to do our final lecture for our muscle unit. This lecture is on muscle contraction. For a muscle to contract, we are going to need some type of stimulation. And for a muscle, the stimulation is going to come from the motor neuron. Remember, motor neurons are the neurons that run from the spinal cord, right, or from the brain to the muscles. All right, so this is our neuron that's going to go to the muscle. And the end of the motor neuron is actually called the axon terminal. The axon terminal is the end that comes really close to the muscle. All right, so if we look at this picture down here, this space, this is our muscle. This is the sarcolemma of our muscle. Right, that's the sarcolemma of our muscle fiber. Down here is where I have muscle fiber written. And this is the axon terminal of our motor neuron. And you notice that it comes really close, but it does not touch. All right, this does not touch. And it doesn't touch because we don't want them to actually constantly be in contact and have that impulse always pass. We want to have that space there. So that space, or the whole thing actually, is going to be called our neuromuscular junction. Right, and our neuromuscular junction is the space where the axon terminal comes close but doesn't touch the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber. In this neuromuscular junction, to have the impulse jump, we need to have some type of neurotransmitter. Which is a chemical that passes the impulse. To the muscle. Okay, so a neurotransmitter is going to be the chemical that's going to pass the impulse from the axon terminal to the muscle. So we're going to need some kind of neurotransmitter in that neuromuscular junction right there. And sometimes, just side note, the neuromuscular junction is sometimes called the synapse or synaptic cleft. Okay, so we're going to have some steps to make this occur. So we're going to start with step one. So for step one, and these are going to be the steps of our muscle contraction. For step one, an action potential or an impulse moves down the motor neuron to the axon terminal. Okay, so action potential moves down the motor neuron to the axon terminal. Okay, and then step two, once the action potential reaches the end, right? Once it reaches that axon terminal, it causes calcium ions to flood into the axon terminal. So to the impulse. Right, the impulse is going to cause those calcium ions to flood into the axon terminal. Right, the calcium ions then trigger another reaction. So step three, they're going to trigger acetylcholine. to be released. Okay, so step 3. In this axon terminal, I have these vesicles of acetylcholine. Okay, so when my calcium floods, it's going to cause these vesicles to move towards the membrane. They merge with the membrane, and they end up releasing their contents into the synapse. All right, so the calcium ions are going to trigger acetylcholine to be released. That was step 3. So I'm going to mark this as 3. Step 4, the acetylcholine, or I'm going to write ACH for an abbreviation. The acetylcholine moves into the synapse. Okay. Once it goes into the synapse, it's going to bind with the sarcolemma. Oops, let me erase that for a second. Spelled it wrong. So it'll bind with the sarcolemma. And cause channels to open. Okay, so these little red dots are going to bind with the sarcolemma. So they're going to come over here and they're going to bind. See how I'm adding them to each of these little receptor sites? Okay, so this is going to be step 4. My acetylcholine binds with the sarcolemma, so it comes and it hooks onto these receptor sites, right? And when it happens, it causes these receptor sites, these guys, to open. All right, it's going to cause those guys to open. All right, and then step 5 is going to be that my sodium Na plus is going to go into the muscle cell, and K plus is going to go out. So when those open, I have Na. I'm going to do Na in green so you can see it. Na plus, all floating around here, right? This is my sodium. So my sodium is going to go in. Sodium goes in, right? And then K, which is potassium, my K goes out. All right, so when we talked about, or we didn't actually talk about it, when you talk about active transport in biology, you talk about sodium potassium pump. That's what that is here. Okay, so this is sodium Na and potassium K. My sodium goes into my muscle, my potassium goes out. All right, when that happens, that causes an electrical impulse. Okay, that causes this new electrical impulse to form. Exchange of my sodium and potassium, and that electrical impulse then spreads over the muscle. Okay, so then I have this electrical impulse that bounces like this over the muscle. All right, my electrical impulse is going to spread over the muscle and go into the muscle. So my electrical impulse spreads over and goes into my muscle. So that's how my new electrical impulse is formed. That's how we pass it from our axon terminal into our muscle. All right, we go through those first 5 steps to pass it. Once we get to that sodium and potassium switching, our new electrical impulse forms. Okay, when that electrical impulse forms, it bounces over the muscle and it causes calcium to be released from your sarcoplasmic reticulum. So calcium inside the muscle, calcium is released. I'm going to put 6 over here. Calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right, due to that impulse, all right? When the calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it causes, so it gets kind of released and goes into these sarcomeres here. All right, so the calcium is going to cause, where is this? Calcium causes the myosin and actin to bind or hook together. So this myosin and actin, I want to do it in yellow right here. These bind. That's what calcium causes. It causes all of these little waves to bind. And then these guys, the myosin, starts to wave. When the myosin waves, it pulls the actin in this way. When the myosin waves, it's going to pull your actin in and cause the sarcomere to shorten, right? That shortening of the sarcomere is actually what a muscle contraction is. All right, so there's what, 7 steps here? Because once our actin and myosin bind, I can add to this one if you'd like. Our myosin waves. And contracts the sarcomere. Okay. So I redrew the sarcomere here, all right? So I want to show you one more time. When these bind, right, myosin's going to bind to that actin. When that binding occurs and the actin starts to wave, it actually causes that sarcomere to change. It ends up looking like this. Once it pulls together tightly, it like literally shrinks in size. And that's what a muscle contraction is. You know how it talked about in the book, the M line and the H zone, and the actin moves towards the M line? That's what's happening here. So our actin, the thinner one, right, actually slides together. Right, this way. I put my arrow the wrong way. So the actin actually slides together, and it ends up so that the M line that was in the middle of our sarcomere, the M line that was in the middle of the sarcomere, this line that was right here in those original ones, look, the actin actually comes together and meets there, and this one is smaller. That's contracted. Where this one has that H zone and that M line, right? M line in the middle of the H zone. This lost its H zone. It's gone. Gone. Right? This is relaxed. All right, so that's how our contraction actually happens. So all of those individual sarcomeres along the whole length of the muscle are going to all contract, which makes the muscle shorten, which is going to pull on your bones, which then makes the movement occur. All right, to stop a contraction, what happens is that as the action potential begins, acetylcholine esterase is released. All right, so right as the contraction starts, right, as the action potential moves down, on top of all those steps happening, we have acetylcholine esterase being released. The acetylcholine esterase is going to break down the acetylcholine. When the acetylcholine is broken down, it's going to stop the sodium and potassium movement, right, which stops the new impulse. Okay, once that happens, the calcium is reabsorbed by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? The actin and myosin are going to detach. Okay, they detach or unlink, right? And when they detach, the muscle relaxes. Okay, so once our actin and myosin detach, then our muscle relaxes, and then our contraction is done. All right, so there's muscle contraction in a nutshell. Ask me some questions tomorrow.